Mach 3, give me crew show on 2, 3, and 4.
Line 1, actually 1.
6, 3. Mach 3, give me start line 2.
5 electric. Mach 3. Line 2, Mach 9.
Mach 3, give me start line 1 and crew show on 7 and 9.
Line 1, crew show 79, Mach 9.
Yeah, do something. I hate weapons.
Super Ops, line 3, Reservoir, Avionics.
Super Ops. Line 4 is code 3 for engine vibe.
Fuck. Hey, so I started a Patreon because frankly, this stuff's getting expensive. Nothing will change the podcast or the blog if you don't subscribe, but if you want early access to episodes, monthly AMAs, episode shoutouts, voting on podcast topics, and all kinds of 20 Years Done gear, head over to patreon.com/20yearsdone. This month's top tier Patreon shoutout goes to Robbie Walker, Travis Barnes, Kevin Traw, JT Owens, Delinda Baker, and Matt Jones. Thanks for the support. Okay, so today I'm joined by somebody I served with in the latter part of my career. I was a lead super. Well, I was a lead super when we initially met, and then I did all those other ancillary roles as you and I both kind of approached retirement. But I'm joined by Lieutenant Colonel retired Heath Wimberly. I worked with Heath when he was director of operations. I was a lead pro super, and then you ended up moving over to flight safety, and you worked with a mutual friend, Jason Walker. So I would visit him, and we ended up chatting as well. But I asked you one specifically because I was curious about pilot retention and what's going on in the Air Force. And I can only really see it from the maintainer's point of view. And I'm really interested in what's going on from the operator pilot point of view. And so you were one of the first people I thought of, honestly. And I'll actually explain why later on.
Okay.
But, why don't you give a little bit of background about your military career, your experiences? Like I'm also fascinated in your experiences overseas in Norway and stuff like that. Sure. And then also what you've done post-military as well.
Certainly. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on, Chris. I appreciate the offer to join you here today. And I look forward to sharing what I know about the issues and hopefully shed some light on some of those issues that the Air Force is facing right now from a pilot retention and force structure perspective. So my background, I was joined the Air Force through LTC at Berkeley, California, and went to pilot training in Del Rio, Texas, at Laughlin Air Force Base, and went right through that into the F-16. Obviously, went to Luke for F-16 school, and then from there, my first assignment was at Cannon Air Force Base in lovely Clovis, New Mexico.
And when did you join the Air Force?
1997. Okay. So I was 97 to 17.
So we ran almost totally concurrent for our service as well.
Yeah. So I joined, did 20 years. So I was at Cannon. Then I went to Vance as a T-38 instructor. From there, I came back to the F-16, went to Osan in Korea. From Osan, went back to Luke as an instructor at Luke. I was noteworthy there. I was the chief of what they call PFT, or basically the production of pilots there, and kind of programming that out. So I learned a lot about this program while I was in that job. While I was there, I was also part of the Air Force One advanced team. So I got to do some pretty cool stuff there as an additional duty. Selected as an exchange pilot out of that assignment, went to Norway for a few years, which was a life-changing assignment. Did that, and then came back to Holloman and stood up the RTUs there, both the 311th and 314th. I was involved in that, and also the TRS. So I was one of 5 of us that were the initial cadre, kind of building that all up, and so I was pretty involved in how we build the program and the requirements and how to try to meet the Air Force's needs while we're moving the F-16s from Luke over to Holloman. So pretty good, a chance to experience look behind the curtain and how we do things there as far as a pilot production perspective.
Yeah, it seems like it's a very it's a good background. Like, it seems like you touched on a lot of different places. especially when it comes to pilot, like pipeline development, teaching, and sort of that coursework. So I'm really looking forward to diving into this. I guess now, so in typical retiree and military fashion, which I've actually avoided pretty good here in this podcast, but typically whenever service members kind of review where they served, the other people immediately want to know the more granular details because there's a chance like we interacted. So when you were in F-16 training at Luke, what unit were you flying with?
Okay, so I went in the B course, I went through the Ducks, the 309th there, and that was back when they were over, the building was over behind the hospital or the clinic or whatever.
Oh, yeah.
Yep. So I was in that squadron as I went through the B course. I went out to the 38. I came back and went through the TX course in the 63rd Fighter Squadron. And I went back out, and when I went to I came back to be an instructor. I was at the 308th Fighter Squadron there, the Knights. I was in that squadron for, I don't know, a year and a half or so. And then I went over to the TRS and picked up that PFT position at the 56 TRS.
Did you ever do FAC A or night flying stuff with the 310th?
I didn't do any of that, actually.
Well, I never interacted with you then.
Yeah, so you're over there with those guys.
That's why you liked me when you met me later on. You didn't have a preconceived notion.
I had no idea.
Okay,
Right.
so here's what I'll say. The reason why I specifically asked you, I took over as lead pro super in the 314th in, it must have been. I think it was April of 2016 is when I took over, and you were, I believe, already in place as the DO, and we did a couple scheduling meetings, and I got a pretty good feel for how you were, and I think you got a good feel for how I was.
Sure.
And I remember there was a scheduling meeting in particular. It was one of the early ones where I'm not sure what happened or what the conversations were on the operator side, but you were kind of tipping the hand, letting me know that there was going to be a big demand on maintenance coming very, very shortly. And it was different from how I had interacted with other pilots. I mean, not all pilots, but in particular, you were specifically asking, could the maintainers on the line shoulder an increased burden from ops? Because you kind of saw, we're going to have to do some hard stuff, and I need to know how close the people are on the line to like collapsing. And probably because there was some empathy going on, because you seemed like there was a lot of care and concern for the people, but also strategically in leadership roles, if your maintenance community completely collapses, you're not getting any sorties ever going forward type of deal. So there's like a dual purpose there. But it was one of the rare times where I saw, as a maintainer, a pilot that was putting the welfare of the maintainers into consideration for the mission, for the scheduling. And for me, it was really, really profound. So that made a mark on me. And that was one of the main reasons why I was like, I think you would be a great person to talk this, because I think you do a good job of seeing the pilot operator sort of perspective, but understanding the role that maintenance plays in that, and how there's a symbiosis between those two sort of cultures and those two teams. So that was big to me. I still remember it. I don't know if you remember. Do you remember that?
I do. Yeah. I don't remember the circumstances exactly what was going on. It was probably had to do with increased production or some ridiculous thing that was being levied on the squadron, where we had to, which dovetails into the reason.
Right. It certainly does, right?
Podcast, right? Where they're saying, hey, we need more pilots, and this is how we're going to get there, and we need you to produce X amount more. And of course that is a direct levy on you guys. And part of that, that understanding, my father was actually a mechanic in the Air Force. He was a crew chief for a few years. He only did, I think, like 6 years or something in the Vietnam era or whatever. But then he was a mechanic for an airline for like 40 years until he retired. So I had a pretty good understanding of what I felt was a pretty good understanding of kind of the maintenance side to some extent, and what's required on that side. And he would come home and share stories with me. It was mostly airline business stuff, as far as his experiences were concerned. And so I had that kind of perspective a little bit, while not encyclopedic by any means. And I'm not an expert by any means on the maintenance side of the house, but at least it gave me a little bit of perspective on the guys on the line and what it takes to generate those sorties and stuff. And he just gave me a little bit more perspective on maybe the right questions to ask, or at least something to ask to get me going in the right direction. Because just like you said, Chris, and it's often overlooked, is like, if we break either ops or maintenance side, either one, if we break somewhere, the whole thing's shutting down from an aircraft sortie generation perspective, and we all fail, right? So if that means we slow down at some point, just keep it going, and we reduce production at some point, just so we can catch a breath a little bit, it makes sense to me, And that was a big part of what I tried to bring to the seat, as far as if I had a chance to catch a breath or a chance to do some things, we would make those make that decision so we can get healthy, or get as healthy as we could given our circumstances.
And this is only semi-related to this conversation, but in my experience, especially with officers, I can almost always tell when an officer has a blue-collar background. There was another gentleman who I served with as an assistant OIC. I think he separated as a captain, Justin Fortenberry. He might be listening. We'll see. We'll see if I get a message. But he also came from like a blue collar background, and they're just, as a maintainer, as somebody that came from a working background, it just, there's almost like there's a lot of body language, a lot of unspoken sort of things that go into that when people come from a similar background. And also, I think it goes to what you were talking about, a consideration for that blue collar supporting force. Because the reality is, I don't know if I would consider pilots to be white collar or blue collar, but certainly it's a heightened professional sort of existence over an aircraft maintainer. And that's just the nuts and bolts of it. Like, you look at how long it takes to get a maintainer through tech school versus a pilot. I think it's, tremendous amount of effort and certifications for the pilot. But having that sort of background, whether you knew it or not, probably informed you a lot more. I know you're being humble with saying you're not an expert on maintenance. Spoiler, I'm not an expert on maintenance either, but there's no other aircraft maintenance fucking podcast out there. So here I am doing what I can do, right? So I kind of want to dive in to why we were probably surging then. Like, you touched on it briefly, and the reality was right around that same time, that's when there started being, at least outwardly outside of the pilot community, that's when I started getting hints that there was a pilot retention / vacuum issue. And as somebody that worked in pilot production for a long time, that was the first time I'd ever been in the, understanding that there was, the pilot production was at this point, in 2016, I think they were talking like, it was like 1,000 pilots total, and like 600 or 700 fighter pilots or some sort of numbers like that. But not to spoil the ending here, it ramped up to like 1,000 plus fighter pilots, and I don't know how many total pilots it was.
Right.
And I didn't have the situational awareness to know, well, how many, like, what percentage are we, I don't know what this is. I didn't know, as a young staff sergeant, tech sergeant, I didn't know how many pilots we produced. I didn't know how many units there were producing fighter pilots. I didn't know any of these things. So 1,000 could mean we're a year behind or we're 100 years behind. I literally didn't know the answer to that. Right. And then, of course, what we're also going to dip into here in a little bit, beyond just pilot production, there's pilot retention. And that's a moving target as well, because if you are losing pilots in mass, then that number for production has to keep pace. And if you're in a vacuum, it has to exceed the deficit, and it has to exceed the deficit in a short term in order to bring the whole community healthy. And that, I guess that's the broad overarching sort of message here. Right. But so we had kind of talked at a pre-interview that pilot retention / pilot numbers had been low fairly consistently, I think, through your career, correct?
It had been, and it's cyclical with the economy, right? And
Right.
and really, the airline industry is there's a direct correlation with airline hiring and the economy and the health of the economy. So as you see, the economy dip, shockingly, the retention rates in the Air Force or in the military in general tend to increase. And then when life gets good on the outside, or the economy's going well on the outside, those numbers tend to wane. And we were seeing this in 2017, where life was good for several years there, and the airlines were hiring. And oh, by the way, there was coming to light a global airline pilot shortage that was going to be happening. And I've seen numbers in the U.S. alone around 80,000 pilots that they were going to need over a 25-year period. Well, the airlines, when I went out to start interviewing for the airlines, oh, by the way, I didn't mention this. I'm an airline pilot now. I fly for Alaska. So I kind of have my foot in the door there, and I kind of see what's going on. So while I was applying in 2017 to these airlines, I went to a hiring conference, and the hiring, like the chief pilots or whatever from all the airlines would come out and address the pilots at these conventions or whatever. And so I went to one, and I'm not exaggerating, Chris. Every single one of them, American, Delta, United, FedEx, they all said, we don't know where we're going to get our pilots from in 15 years. Because if we were to take 100% of all the pilots getting out of the military, and let's call it, all the flight schools that are going, like the Embry-Riddles, and then, University of North Dakota, the big flight schools that are out there. You do 100% of those. That's not even going to cover the requirement. So they were really worried about where they were going to get their pilots. So knowing that, obviously, as the pilot hiring is going up at these airlines, a lot of pilots in particular were electing to get out at the end of their initial commitment, which was it's 10 years from the end of their pilot training commitment. So it's about 12 years or so for a fighter pilot, and you're already halfway there, a little over, and guys were pulling the handle and going to the airlines. It was a big problem. And it still is today, even a little less so right this minute today, over the last year or so, year and a half. Obviously, with COVID, that slammed the brakes on everything. And the Air Force, of course, saw their retention numbers spike. They're like, oh, we don't. And I just read an article this morning as I was preparing for our podcast that the Air Force is like, oh, look at that, our numbers are up. Therefore, we don't have to offer these as many or budget as much as we had in the past toward these retention programs. So I just think it's kind of myopic and short-sighted.
I think that's the understatement of the year.
That's just the way it is. That's the way they do things.
You're right, because unless COVID lasts forever, yes, we are retaining pilots now because the general economy is in a extreme flux, right? I think a lot of people don't perceive the flux that it's in because there's a lot of prop up through stimulus money and all these sort of programs. I think the actual economy, I think the reality is nobody knows. And if I was a pilot, I'd be like, yeah, maybe I'll extend or maybe do this and just buy a little bit of time to see how this all shakes out. And that's for a regular sort of economy, just the assumption. But to think that there aren't other things in play for the pilot retention, and you're right, it's short-sighted. We're talking, you can't do budgetary 1 year at a time. Like, name a successful company that looks at their budget 1 year at a time. And trust me, ATC master, I'm certainly no expert on governmental financing, budgetary things, but from the outside looking in, it seems like we seem to be very reactive in our retention year by year. And that could be a symptom of sequestration, continuing resolutions, and all kinds of these other pressures. But the reality is, just like a poor person going to a payday loan store. Like the less money and less financial planning you have in the future, the more expensive life becomes because the fees hit and all these other things hit. And I think that feels like what the Air Force has been operating in for a really long time.
It seems like it, and to be fair, they have plans in place, and they're flowing out, and they know they have an issue specifically with the pilot retention problem or the pilot. I mean, there's many facets to it. Retention just being one of the three facets to the pilot shortage issue. But they do know they have an issue, and they're trying to address it. However, the numbers right now, it's hard to justify, to the person holding the purse strings. When you go to Congress, for example, and you throw up a chart that says, hey, your retention's at, I'm just going to throw out a number. Right. And I don't know what the number is this past FY, frankly, but I'll say, let's just call it, it's an 80% and it's let's call it a 45 or 50% increase over the year prior, and you're asking for more bonus money so you can budget, and they're going to look at you like you're insane. And you try to impart to this congressperson who may or may not be an expert. They might be just like you or I, Chris, that just got elected. They're now on this committee, and you're trying to talk to them about the budget, and they just don't understand the vision. They haven't been in the seat long or whatever. I don't know. Who knows what the factors are, but they just. And again, I think there is a lot of budgetary pressure for those dollars for sure.
Yeah, and to be fair, my criticisms are definitely aimed more at Congress for the budget and the oversight for a lot of the military things. The military is existing in the environment that the legislator creates for it.
Absolutely.
I'm not saying the military does the best job, but I don't know if I could do any better. To be fair. So.
And that's just, and you make a good point. I think there are a lot of guys and girls out there in these jobs on these staffs. And they're given a very difficult nut to crack, frankly, where their boss comes down, the flag officer comes down, or the 06 comes down and said, here's the problem that we have. And you go, great, I know how to fix that problem. Then the fun part begins when they say, here are our constraints and the things, the tools that you're going to have to fix that problem. And then those fixes shrink way down. Yep. And then us down track on the line, we're like, why are they doing X, Y, or Z? Yep. And really, these are very smart people, just like you and I, that are up there, and they've been operators, and by many of them have. And you think, well, why? How did they get dumb so quick? It's not that. It's just all the constraints that are levied on them, I think, to try to fix these problems that we just don't understand. We don't know the restrictions that they're working under by and large. So
right. So I guess I'll start with, how long does it take to train a pilot from the first time they graduate college and or the academy, and they've now joined the Air Force? They've moved from student status, either ROTC or academy wise, and now they're moving into operational. Although I think at the academy they can get their private pilot's license like through the academy type of deal, I believe, right?
There's like a flight screening program that many of them go to, and ROTC does something similar.
Let's just say nuts and bolts. An officer shows up with a bachelor's degree with their stuff, but they don't have any flight training. How long does that take? What's that process, and what does it start to finish, cradle to grave for time?
For a fighter pilot,
we'll do fighter.
It is about 2 years, start to finish. So you figure. From the time that they show up, boots on the ground, to pilot training base X, whatever it is, that's about 13 months to go through the pilot training pipeline there. From there, they'll go off to, IFF, the introduction to fighter fundamentals for a fighter pilot. That's about a 6-week course. It takes about 8 weeks to go, to get there, in process, out process, all that stuff. So there's then survival school if they have to do that. And then they go off to RTU, which is about a 6-month course, and they'll be on the ground probably about 8 months during that time. So
what's RTU?
About 2 years ballpark. Of course, airlift pilots are a little less. C-22 or CV-22 pilots are more, actually. So it kind of depends. But generally for our guys, or guys and girls, I should say, it's about 2 years.
What is RTU?
RTU for the F-16, 6 months.
Well, I guess what is I don't know what RTU is.
I'm sorry. RTU that's the graduate pilot training. So we have You go to undergraduate pilot training where you learn to fly the T6 and the T38 in the case of a fighter pilot. And now it'll be the T7 replacing the T38. From there, they graduate there, they get their wings, and then off they go to whatever assignment. And let's call it just F-16 because that's what I know the best. So they go to F-16 school, which is now typically at Holloman. They have a couple other places you can fly, but we'll just call it Holloman. And that's graduate pilot training. So it's going to be F-16, RTU replacement training unit, or F-15, F-22, F-35, CV-20, you name what. It's a major weapon system where they learn to fly the airplane that they will be flying for the majority of their career.
Yeah, and I don't know if all the listeners understand, like, and this is how I see it, correct me if I'm wrong, but that pilot training, it's all like really foundational. So it begins with like the basics, ground ops and theory of flight and understanding how it works and all these sort of things. And then you're flying just to basically do the basics. Can you operate? And then you're moving into a little bit more complicated operation to make sure physiologically and mentally you can kind of handle the stress of those things. And then obviously it splits into multiple tracks depending on what airframe you kind of pick for, either fighter community, heavies community, or otherwise. And then you're doing more fighter flight, tactics and things, understanding how, the HUD and all these things sort of interact with just flying the aircraft. And then you move to the platform you're going to be trained on, in this case, F-16, and you're still kind of doing the basics of, okay, how does this jet differ from the previous jets I've operated? It's going to feel different. It's going to behave different. There's a lot of academics. There's a lot of simulation. And what to me was really wild when I got a flight, I realized I was way out of my league for almost everything, was all of that stuff has to become like beyond muscle memory and it sounds so cliche, but it has to become autopilot, where you are physically operating the plane almost as an extension of your body, second nature, because you have to dedicate all of your executive functions to, now you have to understand how your radar works, your radar altimeter, your targeting pods, your nav pods, your HUD, all the new systems that come online, communicating with AWACS, with ground ops, because it's like, yeah, you can fly the plane great, but if you can't identify the target on the ground, you're going to end up killing somebody. So the flight has to be totally built. You have to be 100% confident and good, because you have to reserve 99% of your attention to, I need to do these really complex analyses, both in technology, but also in the law of armed conflict. Who can I engage and let me coordinate? And then that's where you start to see, man, my maintainers are going to hate me for this. That's when you start to see those code 2s creep in, where there's these minor sort of problems where now you have to dedicate some of your mental resources towards, oh, okay, I don't have this system, so I need to find a way to basically jury rig to get the same output. Can I have my wingman paint the target for me since my targeting pod is having problems? And you create all these adaptations, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it's when the fleet becomes so unhealthy that adaptation becomes the norm, then you start really kind of overtasking your pilots. And I've gone a little bit off, but is that a fair maintainer's perspective of what pilot training looks like?
I think that's great. And, and I boil it down to, flying has to be, just like you said, it has to be second nature, where I am now going from concentrating. We, in the F-16 community and the fighter pilot community, by and large, we spend a very, very, very small fraction of our time talking about operating the airplane. I mean, we don't even really discuss it. That is an assumed that we're going to operate the aircraft, very, very well. And I'll just leave it at that. Very, very well, right? We're going to operate it well. And all of our time is now focused on using that aircraft as a weapon. And using all the sensors and integrating that so I can make the best tactical decisions or employ the weapons correctly and all that, and to achieve whatever the commander's intent or the desired weapons effects, or however you want to discuss it. So yeah, that's exactly right, Chris.
So when we were at Holloman, we were kind of faced with a couple of issues that were all creating this perfect storm of pilot generation frustration, we'll say. So from the outside looking in, you kind of peek behind the curtain every once in a while when a DO pulls you aside and explains what's really going on. You would find out that the range was very often, there was restrictions on the range, especially initially when Holloman stood up, where the range was just not available, either short notice or even, we would get lower priority. And, ultimately it's going to be the range management and the Air Force saying what's a more important mission. And they kind of decide that. But we had the physical range limitations, which would cause a lot of thrash in our schedule, reconfigs and all kinds of other things that we had to kind of adjust to. But we also had the way it was explained to me, like the upgrade training for the F-16 track, there was like gates where you had to hit certain milestones before you could progress to the next. So very often when we had like a 6 ship that was flying all wing tanks or something, and we were prepping to roll to centerline tanks like on a Thursday, that 6 ship on a Wednesday was for like 1 or 2 students to meet a specific sort of milestone so they could advance to whatever we are reconfiguring to centerline tanks for.
Absolutely.
And if the range was bupkis, or the weather came in, or we MND'd, or we didn't have enough iron for at least the minimum sort of requirement, or the student screwed up, or whatever, they would be prevented from progressing to the next. And then all the thrash came down where we had to keep those jets as this and do all these things.
Right.
But I think I remember hearing that they were going to try to streamline or remove some of those gates in the syllabus a little bit. Do you remember the talk about that?
Yeah, so there was a lot of discussion about that, and really, to be frank, very little of the consideration had to do with maintenance reconfigures and that.
The truth comes out.
To be honest, when it's a matter of just saving sorties, right? So when we looked at it from a pilot production perspective, it takes, I'm just going to throw a number out there. Let's just say it takes 50 sorties to produce an F-16 pilot. The number is a lot more when you start doing all the direct support and all the other stuff. But the pilot's going to fly 50. Now, if the Air Force says, hey, we need a 10% increase in F-16 pilots, and my first stop as a DO would be to you, Chris, and go, hey, what more can you give me? And you're like, hey, man, I've got guys on weekend duty. We're going, we're bringing guys in just to do what we're doing now. I can't give you much more. I go, okay, well, I'm at my production limit, it seems like, from a maintenance perspective. So then I go back to the planners. I say, hey, maintenance is saying they can't do any more. So then the only other option is to reduce the amount of sorties that are required to generate the F-16 pilot. So let's call it a 10% savings. So instead of a 50 sorties it's required, it's now 45. Well, as a result, you may not be getting the tanker sign off. You may not be getting the NVG sign off or whatever it is. So the bottom line is I'm going to be sending a pilot to Shaw, to Osan, to Aviano, to wherever that don't have the capabilities as the pilot previously. And A3, Air Force A3, the ops side up at the higher headquarters, they've made that decision. They said, yep, noted, got it, salute and press on, but we need the guys getting out the door. We need a 10% increase, and we'll deal with that. So we said, yes, sir, got it, and we make that change to the syllabi to reflect that. And now we send a guy out that's maybe a little bit less qualified, and they show up to base X less qualified. Now the DO there, who has a real world mission, is getting ready to deploy downrange, has a guy that shows up that they need to spin extra training sorties to spin up. So we're kicking the can down the road and levying that on the CAF in many respects. It's robbing Peter to pay Paul. The bottom line is there is a fixed number of sorties Air Force wide. So if you were to take the F-16 Enterprise, for example, all of it, and just look at it, that there's only so many sorties that we're going to be able to produce. Yep. And how you divvy up that cake of sorties is going to be essentially your force structure. And that's a big problem because that number is almost fixed, that sortie cake if you think about it that way. I can't make a bigger cake, right? We only have a certain amount of maintainers. I only have a certain amount of jets, only have a certain amount of pilots. So I can't just expand the cake, just because I need 1,500 more sorties a year. You just can't generate them. We're at that limit.
Yeah, and in episode 3, Bear, who was a DO at Holloman with us as well, he kind of touched on that reduction in sorties and deferring that to the CAF burdened them. They have less IPs, obviously, at the CAF compared to what you have at a pilot production unit at Holloman or Luke. So the few that are IP certified there, they have to do a lot of one-on-one spin up with these guys showing up. So if they get a big influx,
right,
it's like it just piles on, coupled with actually having to deploy and project air power downrange. And Bear also made a comment that a lot of the pilots now just have less sorties because of the age of the fleet is kind of dragging them down. I've argued that the inexperience of maintainers is also causing an issue with fleet health because it takes longer to fix and all these things. And
sure.
So Bear was mentioning that, a major looking at a DO now probably has a lot less hours compared to a DO from 15, 20 years ago. And it goes back to what we were talking about, where the reality is the more time you have in the seat, the more you can defer those executive brain functions to autopilot, because repetition and understanding these behaviors, and it's reactive and it's proactive. A lot of the times you can anticipate that. Literally, I mean, man, it's going to be I need to rename this the Broken Record Podcast, because experience takes time.
Yes.
You just can't shortcut it. You can do virtual reality and AI, and you can supplant it, you can supplement it a little bit, but the reality is nothing compares to time in the seat, or as a maintainer, time with a wrench in your hand, learning and going through it, and it takes time to do. And Bear mentioned that he was concerned that this new generation IPs with less time, it's almost going to create like a generational sort of deficit, because they have less experience to pull from to teach with, and so they're not pulling from this huge experience pool to give it to these younger people. And if we keep doing this, it's going to be thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner. Mishaps are going to go up, and all kinds of these bad outcomes, right? So
for sure.
I mean, I just babbled for a little bit, but go ahead. If anything I said made sense.
No, it makes perfect sense. And Bear, you'll not find a more intelligent, more combat-oriented DO than Bear. I mean, he's solid guy. I worked with him quite a bit, and if he were saying it, I'd take that to the bank. For sure. He's all over it, and I agree 100%. That depth of knowledge is going to, just like you say, is going to shrink down. This is not meant as a disparaging remark toward IPs that are out there doing the job now, or the guys spinning up to be IPs and all that stuff. You're working your tails off, and I admire what you're doing, and I get it. But it really is just a function, just like you said, it's just the amount of sorties guys are flying. When I say guys and girls, are pilots, are fighter pilots, and specifically in this case, they're out there flying. And we used to look at the former Soviet Union pilots, and we would laugh at them getting 120 sorties a year. And we would kind of chuckle to ourselves in our intel briefings going, wow, that's not a ton. And I think nowadays we're doing a lot of the similar stuff. Yeah, we're augmenting that with simulators, and they're very advanced simulators. In many respects, some of the training in the simulator is really good. However, just like Chris, that experience that you get when you're out there busting knuckles on the airplane, and hey, this is how the book says to do it. This is how you really apply that. That whole fog and friction of war, where in the maintenance perspective, there's that, and in ops, there's that too. Flying the jet, those radio calls that don't come through clearly, the radar doesn't work correctly, the targeting pod, weather, clouds, all these other environmental things that are removed and sterilized in that simulated environment where everything is pristine. That is a lot of those factors go into what makes a good pilot, where you're able to adapt and overcome and deal with that fog and friction. And just like I'm sure it is in the maintenance world as well.
Yeah, my maintainers know that while I very often say their experience level is not where it needs to be, I don't necessarily blame them for it. It's like you're not given the time to fail and learn and grow and all those things because we've been, living the poor life financially, like we kind of went through before. We've been on payday. The Air Force has been on payday loans for like 15 years. They just don't know it yet. And we keep rolling over the interest, which is our inexperience and our aging fleet and all kinds of other things. But, I wanted to talk about, I've talked to a few pilots about this, and I think I'm close, but like flying an F-16, flying any fighter performance aircraft, like it's hard to compare it to anything, but if I was to compare it, it would be driving like an Indy car or like a Porsche or like a really nice all-wheel drive Audi with 600 horsepower on a private track, because a lot of times on a bomb range you have all the space you need to do it, and you're getting like endorphins, you're getting adrenaline, you're getting like the reward centers are getting hit when you're successful. Like, look, we're not gonna talk about fighter pilot ego and culture and stuff because, well, we might. It's up to you, but like. I mean, I can understand how it perpetuates, right? Because there's like real psychological things going on with being a fighter pilot, and it's alpha, and you can't second guess. You need to be confident. It's all part of it, and it makes sense. And I equate it to driving like the ultimate race car, flying an F-16 or any of these performance aircraft. And I do not mean to disparage your current occupation, but I would equate flying a 737 to driving the Bluebird bus. And yes, you're still driving and you're still on the road, but it's a radically different performance. And when I kind of plugged that into my brain, I was like, why would anyone leave driving the performance car to go drive the Bluebird bus, right? Like it can't in any way, shape, or form hit those reward centers. It can't feel the same. Yes, you're doing a lot of the same sort of actions that you've been doing for a long time. So there's good pay, and it's a great job. Like, I'm not knocking it, but comparatively, it's radically different. Sure. And it makes me think, if someone's leaving a job that is that awesome, there's got to be, because it can't, besides the fact that a lot of times IPs in particular get tasked with flying a lot, and the polish starts to come off because, it's just not the same as the first time.
Sure.
But it's such a part of probably who you are as a person, who a lot of pilots are as a people. I guess, why would anyone quit doing that? I mean, I guess we'll cut to the chase of the pilot retention. Why do you think fighter pilots are leaving to go drive Bluebird buses?
That's a great question. So using your analogy about you're driving a Formula One, for example, you're on this Formula One team and you're surrounded by great people, the best of the best everywhere, you work in, just like you said, why would you ever leave that? Well, you take that Formula One team and you're on the road all the time, and you're out there at the track all the time, and your family is doing family stuff, and you gotta say, sorry, I gotta go to the track for testing, and I gotta go to the track and run this race, and we're going to Dubai for a week to do testing, and then we're gonna run the race over there, and then from there we're gonna go to Monaco or somewhere else in Europe. I don't know all this stuff, but we're always on the road, right? And then, oh, by the way, let's say I work for let's call it the Ferrari race team, and whereas we used to run 4 cars, now we're running 2 cars. So now team A would do, let's say team A would do Europe 1 year and then not do it years 2, 3, and then year 4 they would go do it again. And team B would do Asia or whatever, and they just kept rotating around. Now we're only running 2 teams, and 1 year I'm going to do Europe, the next year I'm doing Asia. The next year I'm doing Europe. The next year I'm doing Asia, for example, and I'm constantly gone. And that's, I think, what goes into a lot where we just grind these people into the ground. And as we get smaller as a force, we don't have the ability to levy those real world requirements that are out there, whether it's contingency operations downrange, whether it's spin up operations or red flag and training and all these other things that have to be done, and green flags and all the other stuff that goes along with it. Oh, by the way, just the normal cost of doing business stuff that we do, as that Air Force shrinks, that density of operations on the units that are still standing, that load is just being levied on their shoulders. So that's why all these guys are just getting ground down, and these units are getting ground down because they're constantly picking up that slack that has typically been levied or spread out over units. So that's that quality of life that you hear so much about. Hey, the flying's great, and by and large, flying's great. They don't mind going to places that aren't the greatest, but I'll tell you what, doing it 3, 4, 5 times over a 10, 12, 14-year career weighs on a family and weighs on you. And then at some point, it's a business decision, frankly.
Yeah.
You go, well, how many more events am I going to miss with my family? How many? And oh, by the way, if I leave at 12 years and you get a simple earning graph, that allows me 10 years longer at my higher earning in the case of a pilot at an airline where I'm going to be making top of scale captain pay at airline X, for 10 years longer. That's a multi-million-dollar decision.
Yep.
And that math, it gets easy. And yeah, there's, the whole service. I don't poo-poo that at all.
Yeah.
Serving your country and doing that. I think that you have to have that ethos by and large, but that can only take you so far. And I used to mentor my guys, like the Air Force is a big machine and it's just churning. It does its thing and churns and churns and churns. And if you work 10 hours a day or you work 14, 16, 18 hours a day, whatever it is, at the end of that day, that Air Force machine is still going to have its hand out. And it's going to still say there's work to be done, and who's going to do it? And you look around and it's you or whomever, those high achievers that are continually doing that. The bottom line is you have to make that decision for yourself, because no matter what, if you work 24 hours a day, every day, 7 days a week, that machine's still going to have its hand out going, we want more, because there's still more stuff to be done. And it's up to the individual to draw that line. And a lot of people are drawing that line earlier and earlier, or they were until the airlines stopped hiring recently.
And what's interesting about that story is, while that is specific to pilots, I bet there's a lot of maintainers that were absolutely nodding their heads along with it. And it really creates this bizarre sort of feedback loop between ops and maintenance. Like, obviously you and I had a good working relationship. I think there was a lot of trust there. If I said I could do it, I could do it. And if I said I couldn't do it, I wasn't BSing you.
Right.
And I had something similar with Bear too. I think it helps when you have like good people in the right positions, but very often there's a tension between ops and maintenance, where the ops guys are probably just getting burned out and they have this impossible goal of producing this many pilots, and the maintainers are getting burned out because they're doing a similar ops tempo what you just described. And now the pilot's coming out to break their jet and all these things. When the reality is, they're both frustrated, not at each other. They're frustrated at the resources the inadequate resources they've had to adapt to that causes all this churn and all this stress and this ops tempo. But who's your immediate nemesis? It's the pilot coming out, and it's the crew chief that's not miracling the jet ready. And it's really weird how it kind of burden shifts or blame shifts some of that. I think that happens probably a lot more than it should. And it's important for people to understand that I think ops and maintenance are going through their individual sort of stressors levied by the funding, management, and resources, but very often it kind of creeps out through that ops maintenance relationship.
I think there are two parts of that you bring up that I think are very important. The first one, I think, is that trust. So you and I thought we had a pretty good relationship, and it's all about being candid and being able to trust each other. We're trying to make the mission, and I'm not going to levy anything that I didn't absolutely require on you guys, because I knew your situation, and you weren't going to come to me and ask for a reduced production for whatever reason, just to protect guys, or whatever the reason would be, unless you needed to do it, and that trust has to be there. And in some respects, that's, some places you've seen it, and I have too, where that trust has been violated. And now it's I think an unworkable situation. And then the second thing, like you said, that each side going through their challenges to make their side of the mission work in order to to generate those airplanes or whatever it is.
Yep.
Well, the bottom line, I think, in that is we've gone from what previously was contingency operations, like a contingency level of generation and op tempo is now the norm.
Yeah.
And as a result, we're burning through people as a resource, and bottom line is they're a resource, and we're just burning through them.
Mm-hmm.
And then that hurts our experience levels, like you talked about. We're burning through airplanes, we're burning through pilots. I mean, it is rough. And yeah, we've been at war a long time. But while we're doing that, and we're shrinking the force, and you just got to scratch your head a little bit about that, there are reasons why that's happening, and that's maybe a different podcast for a different day. I don't know, but it really is tough. And as we get, like you said, or like we talked about earlier, as we get smaller, that just the more and more stuff is levied on the people that are left standing, and it's rough. So everybody.
I guess we'll shift to, what are some solutions to this problem?
And if I were king for a day, that's tough. That's a tough question. So in my mind, the solution is more iron,
mm-hmm.
more airplanes, right? And obviously with that, we have to staff correctly in order mm-hmm. to do that. We need more squadrons. We need more planes in order to generate the amount of sorties that we need. And by the way, spread out that op tempo over more units and more people, frankly. So instead of doing 4 trips to the sandbox, we'll do 2.5 or whatever it is, whatever that number is. I don't know what the right number is, but the bottom line is we got to spread it out more. By the way, it allows us to generate more sorties, which allows us to get more pilots experience. And by the way, maintainers, in my mind,
yep.
experience, where you can get more people out there. You get a broader force structure in order to build that depth. That's the first step in my mind. Obviously, retaining is huge, because they're saying that the school of thought is it's cheaper to maintain, so to speak, or to retain somebody than bring them up and get them experienced. And by the way, from a time horizon perspective, that makes perfect sense as well. But yeah, I mean, so you got to do that. Well, what I'm saying is you're not going to be able to retain. Yeah, you'll retain, I think, some people on the margins by throwing money out there and all that, and some other ancillary benefits. But that is not attacking the problem. I think if you got to get some more iron to fly. And that will help us and we have to grow the force to some extent to help us out of this.
So maybe I am ready for Congress, because I wrote down in my notes, we need less squadrons.
Okay.
So here's my thought on that. Walk me through it. So I think you made a good point. I would view it as, we need to have less engagements. We need to have less voluntary worldwide engagements. And maybe the word voluntary is my qualifier there that is magical. But,
sure.
My frustration seems to be with Congress. We'll say the levers, legislative and executive, are pulling military levers that they haven't resourced for. So either you need to bump your resources way up to live your lavish military lifestyle, or you need to prioritize and pick and choose where we engage in these things to reduce. Because I would see it as, if we had less squadrons but the same amount of human beings, it would be redistributed. But I think a lot of that also has to do with possessed aircraft and all those number crunching things. But I guess my overarching idea is, rather than raising squadrons to meet the current demand, I would argue, do we really need to be where we're at for all the things for all the time? And maybe that's something to look at. And I think there needs to be some sort of tether between some sort of way to quantify the worldwide military demand on the United States. A way to I hope there's somebody smart enough out there that can make this happen, or it already happens, but some way to quantify the military demand around the world. And then, what is the resources required to meet that? And you aren't allowed to do this unless you've also met a resource threshold, because it seems to me that the funding for the military is divorced from the ops tempo that the military is saddled with and burdened with. And to me, that just defies logic. So
right, and really, I mean, it goes even beyond Congress to some extent. That's a foreign policy decision on where we want to get involved and why, and the president and powers that be that make that decision. And that's a business decision that they've made that it is worth. And we've had chiefs of staff go up to Congress and say, help, at the current rate that we're operating at, we are going to break the force. And
I have that letter. That was in I think 2011. The Joint Chiefs during the sequestration discussion, where it was continuing resolutions plus sequestration, because it was a 10% for sequestration and a 10% for the continuing resolution, said you will create a hollow force. And I'd like to point out that the smartest generals for each service were fucking right, because we're here. We're here. They said it would happen, and it happened. And I'll post that letter in the comments for this podcast as well, if you want to read what they said and go, oh, holy cow. So, Heath, you make a great point where, they're saying they couldn't do it. They're saying you're going to create a hollow force. They're saying you're going to destroy these people. We're not going to be able to keep this up and be able to sustain near peer sort of adversarial encounters. And we're here. So obviously, and again, it goes back to my podcast, 2 weeks ago about cybersecurity. Yep. The sooner we start doing this, sooner we start funding this, the less expensive it's going to be. We need to move away from this. How much does it cost right now? Oh, retention's really high. Let's cut bonuses. You're still in a fighter pilot hole. I don't even know what the numbers are. They were reporting the numbers really big 2 or 3 years ago, and it kind of fell off the national radar. And I think it's a lot harder to get now. But the numbers aren't good, because I think if they were good, we would have heard about that. They would have oh, we cut it down by 500 or something. I think there needs to be a sense of urgency of resources and funding. So I think we were seeking the same outcome between me wanting squadrons to go down, you want squadrons to go up. The reality is we just need more resources for the conflicts, or reduce the conflicts, either or. Right. Retention. So they're throwing a whole bunch of money at pilots. I think they had to create a congressional or an act to increase the amount they could give. It's something like almost $500,000 over a 10-year period, plus base pay and all those other things, flying pay. It's still not retaining pilots, because in your discussion, you only talked about money very briefly when you were talking about, hey, when I transition, the sooner I transition, I'm building, equity in my new career and new things. But you camped out predominantly in work-life balance.
Yes.
And
that's, each person.
I think that's everybody, but go ahead.
Yeah, no, each person has their math equation, right? And how that works out. We've all known people that'll spend, they essentially don't go home, right? They're at work all the time, and they just burn back candles at both ends. And we walk in, they're there. We leave, they're still there. It's crazy, right? And they just continue to do that, and that's great. That's in their equation. I'm a more of what I would term a little bit more balanced, right? Where I made that, there are times where you burn it at both ends, and there are times where you kind of throttle back and do some of the family stuff. And it's at some point, the math just doesn't work out anymore. And it's not a dollar issue, because in my mind, for me, I couldn't put a price on, not being around for a graduation anymore, or having to move my sophomore going into my junior year high school student from let's call it just Holloman, Holloman High School, or Alamogordo High School, I should say.
Go Tigers.
Yep. Go Tigers. And then pull them out of that situation and put them at, high school X, wherever, as a junior or a senior or something. That's miserable. And that has lifelong implications in many respects, for that kid that doesn't necessarily have a say. And really, at some point, to be frank, for me, you look at your career and you go, well, I've probably topped out. I've gone about as far as I can go. And how much more can I do that would be challenging and rewarding for me? I've kind of done a lot, and the Air Force offered me great opportunities to go do things and experience things. but how much more of that's in the future? Probably not so much. And so for me, it was a easy math. I figured out, we had a conversation, my wife and I and the kids, and it was time to pull the plug and move on. And we did. And I think everybody reaches that to some level. And maybe they're driven by, hey, I can get a new Camaro every year, from year 12 to year 20 with that $20,000 to $35,000 bonus or whatever that they give you. Or I can take the $200K up front or whatever that number is now and put a nice down payment on a house that I'm going to live in some other time, whatever. And it's just a math.
And I think that's a good point because, especially from the enlisted side, looking at the officer side, so there's probably going to be some inaccuracies here. So take it with a grain of salt and correct me as I go. But most enlisted are not in a comparable financial situation to most officers, certainly not rated officers that, have a in-demand job that, that also has certain certifications that are nearly, I know you guys aren't ready to walk in the civilian sector right away, but it's a lot shorter of a trip than starting from scratch trying to become a pilot, right? So yes. It seems they took, I call it the financial carrot, right? That's a sort of bonus structure is if you commit for a certain amount of time. It kind of works in the enlisted ranks because A, we don't typically make as much money, and B, unless it's certain career fields like cyber or air traffic controller or stuff like that. But like most crew chiefs, we can't walk in the civilian sector with any sort of certification and make. We have to do a lot of work to get those certifications plus experience. Yeah. So that financial carrot, I feel like it works with enlisted a little bit better because the financial drive motivation is there's more of it. Whereas for you guys, there's probably a little bit more financial security, and the job you would be moving into is also probably going to be in a higher bracket. So it's like, I feel like they're trying to shoehorn in an enlisted retention model into the pilot corps. And I think it just doesn't work. I just feel like it doesn't work.
You'd obviously be the expert on that versus where I am. I should say. But yeah, I would think that one model isn't going to work for everybody, and there's got to be, you have to, be smart about how you apply those programs and things. And maybe there are different motivators for the maintenance force or whatever, whether, I'm just going to throw it out there. I don't even know. I'm just, things I've heard, base of preference kind of things, or being able to stay somewhere for a little while longer, or deference, thing, who knows?
Those are all work-life balance. Like, I mean, I know it seems like we're just keep circling back around, but I think the reality is because of, especially now that I've retired, where I get a lot more control over my work-life balance. Right. Like, I have actual authority and agency over what I do and when. I think there's an innate craving for control of your life that is barred while you're in the military, and it creates this pressure. And you're talking about base of preference. That's just getting to pick where you live, which is, to the rest of society, is essentially the default state. You get to pick where you live if you can afford it, right? You're talking about, picking when you do TDYs or any of these things. It's literally about work-life balance. And I think the reality is, it goes back to, how do you get work-life balance? You have to have more resources. I agree. This is the answer. And it, I like to think that my cognitive biases aren't just wearing me out where I can't see beyond the small little scope I'm in. But you're talking about, we need more jets, and we do need more jets. And I don't mean more jets the way Band-Aid, where, we have so many broke jets, we're going to borrow some jets from another unit and slap it in this unit and fly it. Because in order to have more jets, you need to have the amount of people necessary to maintain those more jets. Absolutely. And any maintainer that's listening is, when you're down to 8 green jets and you're flying an 8-turn-6, it's not going to be good, because one of those is going to fall out. You need a reservoir of iron. You also need a reservoir of people. You need a reservoir of experience. Yes. You need all of these things. So like in order to retain pilots, which is quickly becoming a national security issue, in order to retain maintainers, which is going to become probably a national security issue, is you need more jets, you need more people to maintain those jets, and then you're probably also going to start generating more pilots in training, because I agree, you can't pare down the sorties to a little sliver. Oh, he flew the T-38 once, he flew the T-6 once, he'd been in the F-16 once, then we hit him at head tanker, 4 sorties and sent him out to the CAF, and he's flying over Afghanistan upside down, and everything's going haywire. Like, you can't do that. There has to be a floor. And I'm worried that we've been digging into the foundation a little bit, like we're below the floor and we're chasing. But you know, and again, this goes to, it's going to take more money. It's just going to take more money, and the longer we wait, because here's the reality: we're getting a death spiral in pilots, and we're getting a death spiral in maintainers. The hardworking maintainers, like, I'm throwing deuces. It's been 10 years. I failed PT tests. I've drank too much. My wife left me. I'm out. I would rather I'd rather work at Taco Bell than do this. I don't care anymore. And they throw deuces. And now there's only 5 maintainers on shift. And now they're going to have to pick up that slack. And typically it's the hard workers that leave first because they get relied on so much. So now you've diluted experience. You have less bodies. And man hours are called man hours because it takes a certain amount of men or people, a certain amount of hours to do it. And that draws down. And now you're down to 3. And now it feels impossible. And now corner cutting comes into it because you're still expected to maintain this standard. So safety kind of takes a back seat, and it becomes normal and culturalized. And everything I'm describing, it's also going to apply to pilots. When you have less and less pilots, they need to fly more and more sorties to either train the other guys or fly the missions downrange because they don't have enough, or what they're doing is they're backfilling into the CAF and they're leaving anemic the stateside sort of training apparatus or stateside apparatus. And what you're doing is pilots are flying a whole bunch of sorties and a whole bunch of hours, and they're doing a whole bunch of TDYs, much like your Formula One analogy of going over to Asia and then going over to Europe. Like, as your people draw down, it's going to be more miserable for those that remain. And when their contract comes up, there is not enough money to compensate for that.
It's true. Absolutely. I agree. Just like I was saying, the people that are left standing, more and more are going to be levied on their shoulders to keep the force going. And it's going to be more and more difficult, I think, to do that unless you spread that out a little bit more. They also looked at alleviating some of the workload on that. And I think, again, that's kind of operating on the margin. Yeah. Not the big, where the majority of that.
I mean, I think that's part of the problem too. I think we've been expanding our ops tempo on the margins, where it's incremental, where it's just a little bit more, and a little bit more. When you take the aggregate of the expense of the individual, you realize it's actually quite hefty. And then when we try to make cultural change, it's so gradual and so small. Like, we legitimately need a real shift in how we see this problem and what we're doing. And it needs to be at the national level. And I don't know. I mean, boy, I don't know how you sell to Congress or anybody else that you need to increase your military budget by 25-30%.
There's no way, right? I mean, the budget.
How do you sell that? I need $1 trillion this year,
right? It increases every year, and it took me a long time to figure out. This budget is increasing every year. What is going on? And a lot of people will point to, well, the F-35 costs X millions of dollars, and the F-22 program, and then you have this new command and control program that costs all this stuff. Hey, that's the cost of doing business, really, and that's kind of built in, and they budgeted this out for a long time and all that. But what is going on is the cost of retirees, and that the majority of our budget money and that increase in budget is going to the cost of me and you, frankly, right? Because we're getting out early, we're fairly young, and we live for a long time. And then we start to generate health issues and this and that as we get older, and we start to rely on, TRICARE, or if you're in a TRICARE person the whole time, either way, but the bottom line is that has to carry you for longer than you were in the Air Force, frankly, until, by and large. So that's where a lot of those dollars are going. And that's why we keep shrinking, even though our budget numbers are continuing to increase. And so when you talk about a 25% increase, I think it's going to be more than that in order to grow to where we need to grow. And to talk about the congressional, I guess, feelings about pilot training, and they know what the problem is, and the Air Force has been looking into this. I'll just talk to it from an Air Force perspective. Okay. That we have a pilot shortage, and it's about let's just call it around 2,000. It can kind of fluctuate, and right now it's probably less than that based on the retention over the last 1.5 to 2 years. And that was going to flow out. It'll probably be right around 2,000, and depending upon what goes on, it'll either shrink or continue to grow, depending upon what measures were going to be implemented. Well, the Air Force sees this, and they decide, well, we need to increase production. We cannot increase production anymore at pilot training bases. They're running their race car in the red, right? They've been running in the red line the whole time. They can't do anymore. So the Air Force went to industry, that military industrial complex that you were talking about in previous episodes, to go, hey, we need you to help. The Air Force said, we will provide you airplanes, but we will not provide you anything else. So you need, essentially, they went to industry to go stand up a pilot training base at an airfield that was not military, and essentially generate another pilot training base, because Congress and the Air Force were not going to foot that bill to stand up another base or to do pilot training at another base an existing base. So that's a huge thing. Like, they're looking to private industry to, and I'm not exaggerating, open a pilot training facility somewhere to fly, at the time, T6s and T38s. It's a gigantic undertaking. They wanted to generate 100 pilots a year, right? 100 pilots a year. Right now, the number that we're producing fighter pilot wise annually is right at 300, plus or minus, I would say 10.
So that's a third, right? You're talking about they're trying to privatize a 33% gain on training.
And that's assuming all of them went to fighters, of which, if we're only flying T-38s, I would say that number's probably pretty close, because it's, they're not going to be going to different airplanes by and large from that 38. Just call it 80% of that. So you're talking 240 of the 300, or 80 on top of that 300. So you're looking at 380 now going increase in production. I know I'm throwing a lot of numbers out there, but the bottom line is they looked at the problem and said, hey, we're not going to foot the bill for this in out year money, thinking about all the airmen and all the officers that they'd have to bring on board in order to stand up a whole other, again, essentially pilot training wing. So you think of the whole tail that goes behind that.
You're talking finance, medical, DFAC, all of that stuff, right? You're talking about a lean pilot production apparatus where it's everything that the pilot, POL, maybe like fuel maintainers, schedulers, life support, egress, operators, pilots, schedulers for all that. But what is the bare minimum? And if you have pay problems, you have an HR person at your company. You're not going to go to finance. If you need to eat, we don't have a chow hall. You're going to bring your food, or you're going to kind of do your own thing. So it sounds like they're trying to create this really tight, lean thing. My initial reaction to that is the people they get to staff that is going to be current service members or prior retirees.
Involved in that process, and as far as building those were our targets. Is we were gonna grab that 12-year pilot that was at that decision point. We're gonna say, hey, come to us, and we're gonna offer them some quality of life kind of stuff. And if you look at the pilot training the pilot forecast over the years, the Air Force will say, hey, listen, given a certain model, that those numbers are going to come down. And and that's assuming a total force. So the reserve and the National Guard. Well, frankly, the people that we were looking to grab were the same people that were going to go and step over and do some of that Guard and Reserve flying. Well, we were going to pick them up and they were going to do that flying for us. So it's kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul.
It does. It is. It sounds like the Air Force has to still increase their production of human resources in order to afford the retention tension between this privatized industry and drawing people from the service. And in the short term, it's probably going to be expensive and painful. But in the long term, the investment is we're going to have these apparatus on the side that are concurrently generating human resources for our mission, and it's going to be easier for us in the long run.
I agree with that. It's an investment. Again, when you look at the dollars that you have available, where am I going to plug it in, and what investment is going to give you the most return, for that dollar? And the Air Force has chosen otherwise, and they chose a couple other programs. That this program actually went away, and they went a different direction where they were levying technology and trying to get a return on investment in technology with, Pilot Train Next program, if you've heard of that, where they were using augmented reality and increased simulation in order to affect that savings, that sortie savings. And I think the results were fairly mixed. And so the Air Force has come back to industry after having a little time to study this and see what the results were. And they're asking for a slightly modified version of that program. So they're looking to do that, again. So here we are trying to figure it out again.
So I think the Air Force is also looking at doing almost I don't know if they're serious about it or if I just read it, where it's almost like a flying only track for pilots as well. So you can, I think there's some career stagnation, certainly, if you don't have certain positions. Clearly, if you haven't been a squadron commander, you shouldn't be a group commander. So you're not going to make 06. There's just not a slot for it.
Right.
But if you're a happy clam as a major or even a lieutenant colonel, just flying, where you would get maybe assignment stability, which goes to that work-life balance, and then also you don't have to worry about getting pulled to in resident schools or just doing, and while there are certainly leaders, there's a lot of, we talk about airmanship and stuff like that with flying, there's a lot of leadership there. There's also, I think, some people that just really love to fly and enjoy the kinetic aspect of it and the thrill, and they don't get that being a commander where they're just chasing down OPRs and PT tests and medical readiness and things. Those feel like those aren't valuable missions to national interest, but that's what Squadron Commander spent a lot of time doing. Have you heard anything about the pilot only track, and is it working? Or
it was when I was leaving 2017, they had the rated pilot task force where they were looking at these proposals, and that was one of them. Was the essentially I want to be a pilot and a pilot only, right? And part of that deal was you will make 05 as long as you don't do something stupid, right? And kind of make yourself promotable. You can make up to 05, I should say, but you're not going to be on a command track at all. And that is very appealing to a lot of pilots out there, because they don't want to have to do all I want to put my hand up to be the air show officer just so my OPR bullets get better, or I'm going to go volunteer. I'm not saying that, there are folks that are out there, they do a lot of volunteer.
You can bash on air shows on this podcast. You're way safe to do that.
Yeah. You know what I mean, right? But there are, as you know, there are those guys that are up there that are striving for those jobs or for that promotion and those things, and they'll put their hands up to be and to do those things. And then the rest of us are, like, hey man, I want to do the best job I can. I want to be the best F-16 pilot I can, but I don't need to be an 06. I'm not going to be a commander. The quality cut was made a while ago. I didn't go to school or whatever it was, and I didn't get promoted or I didn't get selected for school. So I know I'm one of those guys. Fine. Then how about I be that 05 and I'll be at base wherever, and I'll just fly as an 05 and be an attached guy working at the wing or whatever it is, because I have a lot of experience or whatnot, and there's something to be said for that. And maybe they could find something similar in the maintenance field where you're like, hey man, I want I don't know if that's a direct correlation. I'm not sure I'd want to be stuck in a particular job for.
Yeah, so that's where it gets weird, where most maintainers have a love-hate relationship with the line, where man, it's hyper rewarding when you get like a problematic jet fixed. That's like the maintainer swagger. Remember I was talking about pilot culture, or fighter pilot culture and ego. Maintainers have, it's just as bad. We're just filthy, right? At the same time. But like when you get a jet fixed, you're Billy Badass and you are like strutting around, and then you start notching them on your belt. And it's same reward centers are getting hit, but it's like you get chewed up and burned out. And part of what I'm only speaking from my experience, you begin seeking I want to get off the line. I want to do training, or I want to get promoted, so I'm driving the truck, so at least I have air conditioning. It's so bizarre. You're like, man, I want to get promoted so I can be in air conditioning. It's like, boy, you fucked everything up if that's your goal for promotion, is you want air conditioning, right? So we're almost kind of chasing to get comfort, but there's also this reminiscing, and you miss the excitement of fixing jets and getting dirty and that stuff. I guess I was kind of an example of that, because I'm not tooting my horn or anything, but like, I was lead super. So that is the tip of the spear for making senior and stuff like that. And at the time I was trying to turn that squadron or that AMU around for production and meet you guys' needs. And we were starting to get that ship turned, and it was going right. But I also realized what I was doing to people in order to get that productivity, and I wasn't right with myself, and I said I'd rather be a section chief. And that was like a bizarre, like, what do you mean that you can't get promoted as a section chief? I'm like, yeah, but I don't. So I kind of waved off. So I think they'll let you do it on a case-by-case basis, but they'll look at you like you're a pariah when you do it. But I think with the officer, you don't have necessarily that choice. Like, that's not a thing that exists outside this program. So what are your thoughts on, and I think in 2016, they started having a small cadre of enlisted pilots going through training to do drones on the Global Hawk for surveillance and stuff.
Yeah. What are my thoughts on that program?
Sure.
I have no problem with it. I think that's great. If there are people that are out there that are qualified and it's something that they want to do, I've got just the fact that they're enlisted is not an issue necessarily for me, right? Again, it's about, can they do the job?
Yeah.
And there's a rich history of enlisted pilots going back, many of our conflicts in previous wars and everything where we had that. I don't see any issue with it. And as long as we can get the job done, I don't see why. Then you'd think, well, why stop at RPAs, or why,
right. Why stop at Global Hawks, right? I think so. The way it was explained to me, and I'm definitely interested in your insights on this. Of a Global Hawk is a non-weapon system. It's just recon. It's flying over. It's loitering, and it's giving really clear images to the ground, and it's letting you know for intelligence and or targeting or whatever. Right. But it's not. It has no weapons capabilities. Whereas most of the drones after, they all have the ability to employ weapons if they're loaded on it. So the way it was explained to me, and I'm interested in your thoughts, is as an enlisted person, you don't have the authority to kind of, or in the Air Force or something, you don't necessarily have the authority or the, I don't think they use the word pedigree, but I think it was kind of implied that you couldn't employ lethal force in that way. You couldn't make that command decision to pull the trigger and kill something, which to me strikes me as bizarre, because the Army does it as a course of business.
Right.
And, there's all these other things, but it seems, and I don't even know if that was true, but the way I see it, if you can fly, and I think the Global Hawk is takeoff and landing is stick controls, and I think the loitering stuff is almost mouse point and click. So it might be a capability issue, and I don't know if that's true either. So if somebody wants to roll into the comments and let me know, that's fine.
Yeah.
But like, is it, whether spoken or not? Have you heard anything about where officers are the ones that are supposed to make those decisions?
I haven't, and I haven't had those discussions anywhere. When I was in, we didn't really talk about it too much. I didn't hear about it too much. I don't know if it's something that's rooted in Air Force, like heritage or and how, and if it's just the way we've always done things, and therefore it's going to be that way. I don't know that answer, so I can't really speak intelligently to it, obviously.
Yeah, I think I think both of us don't know enough to opine, so I'll probably leave it at that. But I would say I think your first knee jerk answer was probably the most correct, which is if they're capable, that should be the only determining factor. Can they do all the pilot stuff? Like can they operate the aircraft? Do they understand how it works and all these things? And then I guess I don't really have anything else. I guess to sum up, I think we both agree that there is a pilot production problem due to an aging fleet and maintenance career fields that are strained, especially since we left. And I don't know if it's gotten much better. We have the lack of time creates a lack of experience, both in maintainers and pilots, that is going to get worse over time if it's not corrected. I think we both agreed that both maintainers and pilots, pilot production, fighter pilots are under-resourced. Where a bigger fleet would give more sorties, and you have more maintainers to maintain that fleet, and they need time to grow and learn. So unfortunately, it seems like the answer is one of the largest budgets in the United States federal budget needs more money.
Yeah, and good luck with that in the current environment, right? It's going to be difficult to sell that with, again, it's all those competing demands for that budget, that tax dollar or that printed dollar, however you want to look at it, right?
Yeah,
so,
that's fair.
It's really difficult, and it's going to be a very tough sell to the American people to go out there and do that again with the competing, especially with social programs or whatever it is. It's just tough.
And it seems like some of the solutions we talked about, or some of the programs that are going on, those are those fringe sort of things that's not going to be that big shift we need. I don't know how many enlisted pilots are doing drones, but I think it's less than a few dozen. You're talking about how many pilots took the flying track. I don't know the answer to that, but I don't think it's permanent in the culture. So these are those small little marginal sort of things that one bad year and you could wipe out all those marginal improvements through those programs. And I think what you were talking about with those standalone privatized pilot training apparatus organizations where it's super lean and super cost effective specifically for pilot training, I think that's that radical or that culture shift that very well could set things straight. It's just investing in it now, which is probably going to be a little bit painful for the long term.
And accepting the risk, frankly, right? From a force perspective, you're going to give contractor X, a huge lump of money and a bunch of resources and say, okay, go produce these pilots. And that's a huge risk. And if, and the contractors by and large will do a good job. Yeah. They'll do a good job. But if there's some sort of a hiccup, or they don't produce as well, or they're not able to meet their numbers, or now you're taking a look at that return on investment, and is it worth it, for that? I happen to think it's a way to crack the nut, frankly, because you have, when you're dealing with these fringe increases like you're talking about, increases in production by reducing the syllabus sorties required or whatever, or you're increasing your production by just a couple of percent on either side, or 5 or 10% on either side. Well, if you're only producing 300 pilots a year, now you're looking at 330. And if you aggregate that over time, and you're talking about a 2,000 pilot shortage in fighter pilots, specifically, you're looking at somewhere around 12 to 1,400. That number again is probably smaller this year, but you project that over time, it's going to take forever to get there from here, right? And that's why you need that 30% increase in production that the Air Force is looking for. That whole, we want 100 pilots a year. And
do you think me from the outside looking in, do you think the Air Force's hesitation with this is because it seems like what you talked about, T-38s, T-6s, that's not the entire pilot track, right? That's just this early part. And much of that pipeline relies on timing. I remember there was more times I could count. We have to graduate by this time. There's not a lot of flexibility because probably you guys were talking to the customers downrange in the CAF, they're deploying, and you're burden shifting something to that IP, and he needs 2 months to spin this new guy up. So like the graduation date was real hard. And I wonder if the Air Force is apprehensive because they would have to build their entire fighter pipeline with a few uncontrollable contractors operating here on that, initial sort of flying training to dump them into the airframe specific training later on, where slots could go unfilled, which would be catastrophic, right?
Right, it is, and that's a very great point. Is we're just talking about the production perspective of it, but then you have the absorption down track. So if you have the pipeline that's opened up, you go boom, here it is, and the absorption pipeline is still here, then we have that problem, and that's a huge issue. So if you're going to be increasing that production, let's say in that undergraduate pilot training portion that we touched upon briefly at the beginning of our podcast, well, now you have to increase that production
downstream.
At the graduate pilot training in order to meet the absorption. And, oh, by the way, at the CAF units farther on down the road, because as we graduate more pilots out of that graduate pilot training, let's say the F-16 school, then you send them off to Shaw Air Force Base, for example. And it's not going to do any good when they're sitting on the rear ends because they don't have enough sorties to fly.
Yeah, like if the fleet isn't healthy there, they're going to atrophy. They're not going to hit CT. They're going to go overdue. They're all going to do these things.
And that's a big part of it. So if you think of it, and it's really, you look at it from a math perspective, you go, oh, well, it's easy just to throw, let's call it, $10 billion at the pilot training enterprise, at the undergraduate pilot training enterprise. Well, that's not the number. And that's not because now you have to look at, okay, well, now I have to plus up Holloman and Tyndall and Luke.
I guess long-term, what if these T6, T38, whatever they happen to be in the future, what if they become the dominant production of pilots in that? Wouldn't you be able to convert Laughlin and Del Rio, Texas, and all these other, initial training bases? Couldn't you convert them into an F-16 base, an F-15 base, an F-35 base? Because you have like that whole infrastructure there. You just need iron at that point, right?
That's great. I agree with that. Yeah. And if you were able to, for example, take that pilot training, the undergraduate pilot training off of the Air Force's plate, and move it to either industry or let's say total force, for example, or something like that. Let's just call it one of those that picks up that. Well, now you can take the Air Force's active duty Air Force or REGAF. You can take those assets and tailor them to meet that absorption and retention, those absorption and retention needs versus just the pipeline need or the production need there, and shift that. That's a seismic change that you're talking about. That's not a fringe change. Now that is a gigantic change in how we do business as an enterprise and a pilot training enterprise. And frankly, I think you're onto something. And I think that's if they want to close that delta between pilots required and pilot production, and you have to increase that. Well, the only way is you're either going to build a base and generate that way, or you're going to levy it somewhere else. And Congress and the Air Force has kind of already shown their cards in that they are not they're not willing to make that investment with those dollars in the idea of building another base or a wing of pilot training. So our hands are kind of tied, right? We got to do something. So I'm not. Looks like that would be a reasonable answer, except for there is a significant amount of risk for sure.
Yeah, but it seems like they could do a proof of concept. And also, like, here's the deal. Like, these companies aren't going to be populated with unknowns. It's all going to be military. And and you get to pick your heavy hitters. You get to pick the people that it's going to be a little bit of money on the upfront. But if you're going to do a proof of concept, man, I'll tell you what, I'm sure I'm not the only maintainer that does this. Maybe pilots do it too, but I used to fantasize like towards the end of my career. I'm like, and that's not a good word to use, fantasize, by the way, but I used to like, it's like, fantasy football. It's like,
Yep.
what if I had the best chief, the best senior, the best supers, the best expediters, the best 7 levels, and the best like senior airmen, and they were all like humming along. Like I'm reaching back in my career to all these great names like Tom Rushton, Pete Saccone,
We all know.
like Bouchon Arnold. I'm reaching back to all these heavy hitter badasses of all different levels. I'm like, can you imagine a unit comprised of that? And that's the thing with what you're talking about. If you're talking about a proof of concept, let's build a super unit. Let's build the A team of maintainers. I'm not volunteering, by the way. I'm going to law school, and maybe I'll draft the contract for you, but I'm not going to run it anymore. But like much like I talked about with the military networking with Kevin Traw in episode, I think it was 39. In episode 38, like. The network that we have as service members, and you're talking about networking, it's like an F-16 community. Like I'm talking about Bear, and you know exactly who I'm talking about, and you know how good he is. So like, if you found out that Bear was standing up one of these operations, you would go, "Oh, that's going to work," because he knows exactly what he's doing. That's going to be fine. And if Bear is the standard that they're hiring all their people for, that's going to be the premier unit in no time. And that's one of the perks of private industry is you can hire and fire based on performance. You're not saddled with how many times have we had a dude show up at work? You're like, what's this guy's thing? Like really 2 years type of deal. And there's nothing you can do. You can hire and fire. It's all merit based. You can give bonuses based on productivity and stuff like that. It's a great model. And I think if it was me, if I was SecAF for a day, it would be some major changes, but I would at least, let's do a proof of concept on this. Like, how much could it possibly be out of a budget of $730 billion? Like, you're saying I can't kick 50 or 60 million towards this and run it for a year contract and see if we can't gen this up? That seems reasonable.
I was involved in that. Frankly, I have a company on the side that we were doing just that. We were brought in with major defense contractors as part of a team to build that plan. And we actually put in a proposal for that pilot training plan that we discussed earlier. And we were going to execute that proof of concept. So the model that you were just talking about is right in line with what we were doing. We were handpicking, the people that we want involved. We were talking to them, and we had a whole game plan of just who we were going to bring in and how we were going to execute that. And just like you say, you can shape the team however you want and kind of reduce that risk level to the enterprise, but by bringing in people that those known quantities that you've seen operate under different circumstances and situations and dealing with challenging problems, that they are going to rise to the top. You're going to reduce that risk. And oh, by the way, I don't have to deal with OPRs. Oh, by the way, I don't have to deal with the PT test. And I don't have to, this is going to be by and large, a 9-to-5 job.
And you could be at that location with your family, stability, all these things, and you're good to go.
Right. And that's just it. And guess what? When you've had enough, you put in your, you leave. You're going to be by and large, a 1099 employee. You're just like, hey man, that's it. I've had it. Got it. Thank you for coming. Thanks for helping us with this or whatever. It was, I think the plan is viable. We're still waiting, we're waiting to see what this new proposal is going to look like. And we're hopefully going to be involved in that as well. And maybe sometime soon you'll start to see some progress in that area for sure.
Yeah. Shoot me a message and let me know if anything like changes on it. I'd be interested to see, cause I want to keep my eye on it because like, I know a lot of times I'm doom and gloom and I sound like really cranky and salty, but like I want things to work. I want things to succeed. Sure. I just see a lot of problems. So when I see those types of initiatives kind of gain traction, I usually want to take a close look at them to see how they're performing. So especially when it's apparently an idea that I just cooked up here on the spot with you that almost identically matched what you're talking about doing anyway. So
right, and that's we could talk offline or another time, based on that or whatever. But it is, we've done a lot of plan. I'm talking years with these groups of defense contractors that are out there. We have a team together of very large defense contractors that you would know that we've been involved with planning this and putting this together. Oh, by the way, there's a maintenance side to this as well. It's not just ops. So it was all ops and maintenance putting this together, and life support and all this other stuff, just like you think, you know, of a full up flying operation, minus air traffic control, because that's going to be FAA, but we were doing everything else from on the flight line essentially. So it's all there. Those opportunities might be coming. So those of your listeners to this podcast, keep your ear to the ground, because there might be opportunities out there with some of these contractors that are out there to stand up this program. It might not involve us. It might be another group out there that gets picked to do this if the Air Force moves forward. But there could be a significant opportunity to be in on the ground floor, something very exciting to help the Air Force dig out of a problem that it has, and to really to be a huge part of helping them fix this issue.
Yeah, and I'll put that out there now too. Like, keep me updated if there is a proof of concept and they need bodies or need to hire, whether it's you or you're just supporting the idea of it because it's the right call. Give me a holler. We'll get you on the podcast and we'll talk through it, either for you guys or for any of those industry people that you're talking about, because part of that is getting the message out to the maintenance community. I think my listeners are like 90 to 95% maintenance, so it's a good little. Well, it's not little anymore, but it's a good community that you can kind of pull from. And I know a lot of my listeners are looking for that next step. Moving out of the military too. So I think that works out quite well, which, by the way, this is networking. If anybody's curious what networking looks like, that's what this is. So other than that, Heath, I can't thank you enough for taking an hour and almost 40 minutes out of your day to talk on this subject, allowing me to kind of pontificate of what I see from the outside looking in. I was glad to know that I was mostly aligned with reality. That's always a good spot check. And again, like, thank you very much for our time together serving and your concern for the guys on the line. Like, you may not have known it at the time, but that type of treatment and consideration and empathy for the workers, it probably amplified through the people working on the line more than I'll ever be able to quantify. It makes a big deal, and it goes back to that: take care of your people, and then they'll take care of you as well. And I wish I knew more people that did that. So thank you.
I appreciate the compliment. It was my pleasure. Anytime I could give you to your podcast here, I enjoyed it. Hopefully I shared something that your listeners got something out of there. And your last comment, I'm shocked that it's not the rule, it's the exception. I just wish more people just seem like, you know, basic human being, you know, kind of thing. And
we'll talk offline right after.
All right then. But thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you having me on.
Okay. Thanks, Heath. I appreciate it. And that's it for this one. Adios.